Professor, and thank you for having us in this class, and thank you all for being here. I'll be very quick, but I just wanted to mention that this is part of a series of public lectures that we do on different topics, and if you're interested, let us know, either myself or Amy Correa, who's right there in the back. We're going to do, for instance, a lecture coming up in a few weeks on Hershey, Cuba, the history of the Hershey involvement with Cuba before the revolution. Next week we're doing a memorial, panel discussion in memory of William Matos, who just recently died, and so on. So I don't want to bore you with the details, but just to let you know that we have a very active program of public events. So let me now introduce briefly our speaker, Nancy Regal, who earned her PhD in history from Columbia University, where she also received the Richard Hofstadter Fellowship. She also holds a Master's of Philosophy and Master of Arts in History from Columbia. Her BA in History is from the University of Havana, Cuba, where she was also a research assistant at the Center for Martí Studies and the National Archives of Cuba. Previously, she was an assistant professor of history at Adelphi University and a visiting assistant professor of history at Lehman College in New York. Her teaching and research interests focus on the social, economic, and political history of Cuba, which is the topic of today's talk, but also on African slavery in Latin America and the Caribbean, and migration in the 19th and 20th centuries. She has conducted extensive archival research at various places, such as the Library of Congress, the New York Historical Society, the New York Public Library, the National Archive of Cuba, and several provincial archives in Cuba as well. And she has lectured on these topics of her interest at Princeton, Harvard, and the City University of New York. So it's a great pleasure to be with Nancy Regal.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Professor Hobodwani. Thank you, Professor Masordo, and members of the CRI for having me here today in this class. Good morning to all of you. So this talk is about a local history. The history of a small town in Cuba, Báez. So to give you an idea of what Báez was in the 1950s, which is the last decade that I cover in my study, I would say that in 1953, which was the last census of the Cuban Republican period, Báez has a population of 6,714 people. To put those numbers in perspective, could you hear me? Sorry, do you hear me? Do you hear me? Okay, great. So to put those numbers in perspective, let's say that the entire population of Báez in 1953 could perfectly fit in one section of the FIU Stadium, which has a population of 23,500 people, right? So that gave you an idea, that's giving you an idea how small this was, this town, right? How small was it? Yes?
How do you spell the name of it?
Báez, B-A-E-Z, Báez. E-C, okay? So, but this wasn't a small town, and my topic is to discover what was the impact of those people, right, in the history of Cuba. As a student of Latin American civilization history, you probably know about the importance of silver mining production in Mexico and Peru, right? Or the importance for the colonial administration of sugar plantation economies in Brazil and the Caribbean. Or the impact, the importance, the significance of the port cities for colonial administrations, as was the case of Buenos Aires in the late colonial period, connected to the export economy, right? The Atlantic world in the case of Buenos Aires. But we know less about those towns that were surrounding the big centers of production, right? They were not directly part of it, but they have their own history. And his people has also their own history. They were not connected to the export economy, and they were not, and for that reason, they developed in their own ways, right? In their own ways. And they are not invisible. They have something to tell to the regional, local, and of course, national history. In the case of Cuba, we could find a lot of documents in the colonial period that talk about Cuba, a strategic position at the entrance of the Gulf of Mexico. And how this was considered an advantage and justified, an advantage for the colonial government's perspective, and how this justified Cuba's enrollments in the colonial enterprises, right? But those are the first village founded by the conquistadors in Cuba, for the map. As the history of the population shows, those villages that were founded on the coastal area were the one who has a history of exposure to the exterior. It was not the case for those interior lands that have a different development, a very slow-paced development. So, what is Báez? Báez is a small town located in this region, the central region of Cuba, right between Trinidad and Sanchez Spiritus. That region is called Las Villas, precisely because it has several foundational villages from the 16th century. So it was a small town. The inn is social and economic activity dedicated to the production for the internal market. Cattle raising, diversified to small scale, subsistence production, agricultural production, and of course, very well connected to the internal market. Demographic population, different to those areas that were more related to the sugar economy, to slavery. They have a population, free people in terms of slavery, free people, and white population in the area. Of course, because it was not related to the sugar economy. So in its pattern of role and its social and economic structure, Báez was the norm for most non-sugar regions beyond the colonial period, in the Republican period as well, between 1902 and 1959. That is in those zones in which the white population constitute the dominant majority, and in which small-scale agriculture, cattle raising, commerce, and small-scale manufacturing create certain economic stability instead of a dynamic development capable of transforming the traditional economic structure of the localities. So what is the contribution of this study to the history of Cuba? It's very simple. Báez is a good example to demonstrate the less known history of Cuba, the history of those considered secondary localities because their impact on the economic development of the island. But with this story, I tried to show the diversities, right? The diversities of Cuban regional development, the diversity, the complexities of that development as well. So let me give you a brief history of Cuban population. At the time of the conquest, the Cuban population was, the indigenous population was not as large as was in other areas of the continent, and the bigger numbers were located in the eastern part of the island. They were moving to the west, and that process was interrupted by the conquest, as for the reason that you probably know, violence, diseases, and hard work justified the decimation of the indigenous population in the Caribbean and other areas as well, as was the case of Cuba. So what happened was that the first villages were founded by the conquistadors, and in the early 16th century and to the middle of the 16th century, most of these villages were depopulated because people were joining the colonial enterprises. So what happened with the interior lands that was, for the sort of reason, all completely depopulated? So what happened to those indigenous land, and how was their development throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th century? So how does this were organized? I'm trying to look at Báez from the perspective of that region that I mentioned, the central region of Cuba. So because it's not an isolated case, I have to look at what's happening in its connection with other regions of that, other areas of that region, and with the at the national level as well. That's why I put the history in the context of that region. So what is the origins of the town? The land question, which is very important. I mentioned that at the beginning, those areas, the main village was almost depopulated. And this process changed throughout the 16th century, started recovery of that. Why? Why do you think it is the recovery of after the first stages of the population. What do you think has happened in other areas of Latin America? What do you think there was a recovery of that population? What do you think is the justification for the early recovery, let's say in the first half of the 16th century, mainly in the Caribbean area? Any idea? Any idea of why the population was start to recovering? Well, let's say that after the first movement to the colonial enterprises, after those who abandoned the island, there was some that continues coming and remain there because there was a demand for products, particular productions in the colonial enterprises. And Cuba doesn't have silver, was the case of Mexico and Peru, but Cuba has plenty of lands. But lands by itself mean nothing. Lands have to have a purpose, right? So the first distribution of land, and this topic is very complex in the case of Cuba, the first distribution of land and penetration to that interior land in the 16th century was led by the local elite. And the local elites were so active in that process precisely because there was not other, I mentioned there was no silver or gold, but they also didn't have the opportunity to get the highest position in the government because those positions were reserved for Spaniards that came from the peninsula. So they looked at the potential of having land to connect, to make that recognition, that status recognition also to connect them with what was going on in the colonies. But also because there was a recovery of the population, and population centers demand certain, of course, production, agricultural production, and of course cattle byproducts. So that's the reason why the process of to move to the interior land to get recognition, to get ownership of the interior land starting in Cuba so early and mainly in that region from the 16th century. So what happened in the case of Báez? Let's say that the first colonial document that deal with Báez was mentioned it as an Ato de Vacas. Ato de Vacas is, let me show you this. That was Báez in 1804, an Ato de Vacas. The Ato de Vacas means a granted land for cattle raising economy. They were later called haciendas, and the first notice of that was in the 1804. So, what are the reasons behind that expansion and the recognition of that area as an atoll? Because there was a demand for cattle raising in the population centers, that was the case of Havana and the main village in the center part of the island, but also in the Havana region, there was a start in the process of tobacco cultivation, and also because the mercantile flota from Spain stopping there, it was a tremendous impact, and that generates a demand for that kind of production, foodstuff production, and of course cattle production. So Báez started to send cattle to the main village of the central region, mainly Santa Clara, which was the jurisdiction, another jurisdiction created in that region in 1689. So Báez started to contribute with that to the articulation of the early internal markets. And with that, in that process, let's say that it was not a road system, it was not a transportation system at the time. So what really happened is that with movement of cattle to different areas, the proximities and the population centers that were more close to that, there was an early articulation of certain roads, right, very precarious in their conditions, but the articulation of that, and people were moving, were knowing each other, were creating a dynamic, were very particular to that area. From 1804 to the 1790s, what prevailed in the atoll was an extensive exploitation of land for cattle raising. What means extensive exploitation of land? Means that the cattle was pasture free throughout the whole territory, and it was free. It was not organized in that sense. In order to provide for those centers that I mentioned. Also, another important aspect to keep in mind in the 17th century is the impact of contraband. So there was a lot of products that came out of that region to contraband. So that's also what justified the creation of this in 1804. Another aspect to that is that if you look at the Cuban economic cycles, that we will see first cattle raising activities and production for the population centers. Later on, after 1790s, the sugar production and slavery, and of course, that process, which started in 1790s, remained until the last decades of the Republican period in the 1950s. You see that those big export economies, those populations were connected to the export economy, developed very different. In the case of Báez, what's happening with this was, in the 18th century, the early 18th century, what the population, the demographic composition, that were free people, the so-called free laborers, right? Rural workers or peones, and those people who were there were in charge of the capital that was in the hacienda, because the landowners at this time were not present. They were in the city of Santa Clara, so they were taking care, and that justified the slow pace of demographic movement to the areas, because they were mainly single men, and